Alright, welcome back to WILLSTAR Monsters and Mysteries. In today's video, we are going way back. I've had a viewer email me a newspaper article from 1837. Now this article tells an amazing story about an adult and two young creatures that are captured and brought back to Boston, Massachusetts and put on display. I can't wait to give this one to you, but real quick before I do, I'm getting a lot of comments saying that you guys aren't getting notified about the videos. If that's the case, just hit that notification bell, click all, and you should be all good. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome. If you dig the video, check out some more. If you like the rest of the videos, go ahead and think about subscribing. And everybody knows how it works. If you guys like the video, make sure you hit that like button and leave me some comments. Hitting that like button and leaving comments is like crack for the YouTube algorithm. And another thing really quick, I'm battling allergies really bad, so please bear with me. Alright, that's enough about that. Let's go ahead and get into this one. The Boston Daily Times, 1839. When will wonder cease? Robert Lincoln, Esquire, agent of the New York Western Lumber Company, has just returned from the St. Peter's River, near the head of steamship navigation on the upper Mississippi, bringing with him a living American orangutan or wild man of the woods with two small cubs. Mr. Lincoln informs us that he went out to the Northwest as an agent of the New York Lumber Company last July, with a view to establish extensive sawmills on the pine lands near the Falls of St. Anthony. And he has given us detail of the operations of the company and the circumstances which led to the capture of the extraordinary creatures mentioned above. Those who are acquainted with the leading features of the Valley of the Mississippi are aware that there is little or no pine timber throughout the states of Illinois and Missouri, or in the extensive territories of Wisconsin and Iowa. The inhabitants of that region are obliged to use oak and walnut for common building purposes, and the labor of working such materials is very great. The greatest portion of the pine timber that finds its way into the upper part of the valley is floated down the Ohio, and from thence carried up the Mississippi and Illinois rivers by steamboats. The most ordinary kind of pine timber is worth $60 per thousand in any part of Illinois or the territories. In New England, the same quality sells for about half that sum. There are some very extensive and immensely valuable pine lands near the Falls of St. Anthony on the upper Mississippi, but until recently they have been in the possession of the Sauk and Fox Indians. In the summer of 1838, a treaty was ratified with these Indians, by which they ceded the whole of their pine lands to the United States. The ceremonies of this treaty were performed at Fort Snelling about the 1st of July last. Captain Marryat, the famous English novelist, was then on the upper Mississippi and was present to witness the war dances on this occasion, which it is said were conducted with unusual splendor. He also spent several days among the Indians, and by the assistance of the American officers at Fort Snelling, obtained a large collection of ornaments and curiosities. Some shrewd men at Albany and New York, who knew that the treaty referred to was about to be ratified and who were aware also of the value of the timber, formed a company with a substantial capital and engaged a large number of enterprising mechanics and laborers to go out and establish sawmills for cutting timber on the St. Peters. They rightly supposed that the land would not come into market, as the phrase is, for several years, as it was worth but little except for timber. Those who wish to obtain land for cultivation go into the more fertile parts of the territories. Companies may therefore claim land, establish mills, and cut off the timber wherever they can find it, without fee or license. The timber may then be floated down the Mississippi in log rafts for a mere trifle and sold at the highest prices anywhere on the river. The New York company sent out their expedition last July. The workmen and laborers with the principal part of the machinery went by way of New Orleans, and at that city they chartered a steamboat and proceeded up the Mississippi. The whole business was under the direction of Mr. Lincoln. They had on board all the necessary tools and saws, together with the apparatus for a grist mill, oxen, horses, cows, and a good stock of provisions, arms, ammunition, etc., etc. They passed directly up the river, only stopping to take in wood and water, until they reached the Prairie du Chien at the mouth of the Wisconsin. Here they put their animals on shore and remained 2 days. On the third day, they re-embarked and finally reached the St. Peters in safety. Their enterprise proved highly successful. They found the timber of the first quality, and the facilities for building mills much greater than they anticipated. The work went on very prosperously, and in a few months, Mr. Lincoln had the satisfaction of launching his log rafts on the headwaters of the Mississippi. They continued to prosecute their labors vigorously until winter set in, when a part of the workmen started for St. Louis, and a part of them remained to superintend the cutting of timber. During the winter, Mr. Lincoln and several of the workmen made frequent excursions in pursuit of game, which was very abundant, and their camp was one continued scene of festivity. The Indians brought in large quantities of furs, which Mr. Lincoln purchased for a mere trifle, and lined his cabins with them throughout, which rendered his rude huts very warm and comfortable. The whole party were as hardy as bucks and appeared to enjoy themselves exceedingly. About the 15th of January, 2 of the carpenters who had been out in pursuit of a gang of wolves that had proved very troublesome came into camp and reported that they had seen a huge monster in the forest, on a branch of the Mississippi, having the form of a man, but much taller and stouter, covered with long hair and of a frightful aspect. They stated that when first seen, he was standing on a large log, looking directly at them, and the moment they raised their muskets, he darted into the thicket and disappeared. They saw him again in about half an hour, apparently watching them, and when they turned towards him, he again disappeared. Mr. Lincoln was at first disposed to think lightly of this matter, believing that the men might have been mistaken about the size and height of the object, or supposing it might have been a trick of the Indians to frighten them. He was informed, however, by some of the natives that such a being had often been seen on the St. Peters and near the falls of the Mississippi, and they proposed to guide a party of the workmen to a bluff where it was thought he might be found. The men were all ready for an adventure, and arming themselves with rifles and hunting knives, they started for the bluff under the direction of Mr. Lincoln and the Indian guides. On the way, they were joined by several of the natives, and the whole party numbered 23. They arrived at the bluff late on the afternoon of the 21st of January, and encamped in a cave or grotto at the foot of the hill. Early the next morning, 2 of the Indians were sent out to scout, and in about an hour returned, and said that they had seen the wild man on the other side of the hill. The whole party immediately prepared for the pursuit. Mr. Lincoln gave positive orders to the men not to fire upon him unless it should be necessary in self-defense, as he wished, if possible, to take him alive. The Indians stated that although a very powerful creature, he was believed to be perfectly harmless, as he always fled at the approach of men. Mr. Lincoln was giving his men their instructions when the wild man appeared in sight. He ordered them to remain perfectly quiet, and taking out his pocket glass, surveyed him minutely. He appeared to be about 8 or 9 feet high, very athletic, and more like a beast standing erect than a man. After satisfying himself with regard to the character of the creature, Mr. Lincoln ordered his men to advance. The Indians had provided themselves with ropes, prepared to catch wild horses, with which they hoped to ensnare and bind the creature without maiming him. The instant the company moved towards the wild man, he sprung forward with a loud and frightful yell, which made the forest ring. The Indians followed close upon him, and Mr. Lincoln and his men brought up the rear. The pursuit was continued for nearly an hour, now gaining upon the object of their chase and now almost losing sight of him. The trees, however, were quite open and free from underbrush, which enabled them to make their way very rapidly. Whenever they came very near him, he started forward again with a yell and appeared to increase his speed. He finally darted into a thicket, and although they followed close and made much search, they were unable to find him. They then began to retrace their steps towards the place of encampment, and when they were within about a mile of the cavern, the wild man crossed their path within 20 rods of the main body of the party. They immediately gave chase again and accidentally drove the creature from the forest into an open field or prairie. The monster appeared to be much frightened in his situation and leaped forward howling hideously. At length he suddenly stopped and turned upon his pursuers. Mr. Lincoln was then in the advance. Fearing that he might attack them or return to the woods and escape, he fired upon him and lodged a charge of buckshot in the calf of the creature. He fell immediately, and the Indian sprang forward and threw the ropes over his head, arms, and legs, and with much effort succeeded in binding him fast. He struggled, however, most desperately, gnashed his teeth, and howled in a frightful manner. They then formed a sort of litter of branches and limbs of trees, and placing him upon it, carried him to the encampment. A watch was then placed over him, and every effort made that could be devised to keep him quiet. But he continued to howl most piteously all night long. Towards morning, 2 cubs about 3 feet high and very similar to the large monster came into the camp, and were taken without resistance. As soon as the monster saw them, he became very furious, gnashed his teeth and howled, and thrashed about until he burst several of the cords and came very near effecting his escape. But he was bound anew, and after that it was kept most carefully watched and guarded. The next day he was placed on a litter and carried down to the mills on the St. Peter's. For 2 or 3 days, Mr. Lincoln says, he refused to eat or drink or take any kind of food. At length, however, he began to eat, but from that time his howls ceased, and he has remained stupid and sullen ever since. The cubs took food very readily and became quite active and playful. Mr. Lincoln is a native of Boston, and some of the workmen engaged at his mills are from that city. He arrived here Saturday afternoon in Boston with the wild man and the cubs, and they were all removed from the vessel that evening. By invitation of Mr. Lincoln, who is an old acquaintance, we went down to his rooms to examine this monster. He is a very horrid-looking creature. He is about 8 feet 3 inches high when standing erect, and his frame is of giant proportions in every part. His whole body is covered with a hide very much like that of a cow. His arms are very large and long and ill-proportioned. It does not appear from his manner that he has ever walked upon all fours. The fingers and toes have stout claws. His head is covered with a thick, coarse black hair like the mane of a horse. The appearance of his face, if such it may be called, is very disgusting, nay, almost horrible. It is covered with a thinner and lighter coat of hair than the rest of the body. The mouth is very large and wide, and similar to that of a baboon. His eyes are quite dull and heavy, and there is no indication of cunning or activity about them. Mr. Lincoln says he is beyond dispute carnivorous, as he universally rejects bread and vegetables, and eats flesh with great avidity. He thinks he is of the orangutan species, but from what little we have seen, we are inclined to consider him a wild animal, somewhat resembling a man. He is, to say the least, one of the most extraordinary creatures that has ever been brought before the public, from any part of the earth, or the waters under the earth, and we believe will prove to be a difficult puzzle for the scientist. He lies down like a brute, and does not appear to possess more instinct than common domestic animals. He is now quite tame and quiet, and is only confined by a stout chain attached to his legs. This is the first creature of the kind, we believe, ever found on this continent. It was to be expected, however, that in penetrating the remote recesses of the New World, monsters would be found, and great natural curiosities brought to light. And it has been a matter of surprise to many that so little of the marvelous has ever been discovered. But we cannot tell what the wilds of the far northwest, the shores of Lake Superior, the regions of the Rocky Mountains, and the vast territory of the Oregon may yet bring forth. It is Mr. Lincoln's intention to submit these animals to the inspection of the scientists for a few days, in order to ascertain what they are, and after that to dispose of them to some persons for exhibition. Mr. Lincoln himself will return to the St. Peter's in the course of 2 or 3 weeks. P.S. Mr. Lincoln informs us that he will exhibit the wild man and his cubs gratuitously this forenoon in the rear of No. 9 Elm Street. We presume our citizens will not be slow to take advantage of this offer.